even though a lot of the treaties and the international negotiations, of course, reinforce the notion of trying to keep space peaceful, it's important to note that space has always had a military aspect. It hasn't been exclusively civilian activities happening in space.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Space Policy Show by the Aerospace Corporation's Center for Space Policy and Strategy. I'm Colleen Stover. This is the next installment of our six-part series on contested space. Today's show is about the development of theories of war and deterrence in space. We've got two policy experts from the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, Dr. Mick Gleason and Robin Dickey. And they'll be covering the history of how U.S. strategists have viewed the space domain, and then how that pairs with recent efforts to develop norms of behavior for space. Well, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Mick. It's great to talk to you.
Hey, Robin. Great to see you again. Looking forward to our chat today.
So, as you know, both of us have spent quite a bit of time researching and writing about a lot of different things related to contested space. Norms, deterrence, space power theory, debates about space weapons. We've got quite an interesting repertoire between the two of us. So I'm excited today to do almost a chronological mashup of all of this different kinds of approaches that we could take to the question of contested space theory. So let's get started by going kind of back to the beginning. I always think about 1957, the Eisenhower era, as being foundational for a lot of our different both policies and habits of thinking when it comes to space. What do you have about that?
Yeah, well, I think you're exactly right. A lot of what we're thinking about today traces all the way back to the very beginning, and you can trace that thread pretty clearly in some cases, not always, but quite often. But we also have to remember that things have changed. The geopolitical strategic context has changed over several years, over the decades, so to speak. And, it all started in the context of the US versus the Soviet Union with nuclear deterrence and the fear of nuclear war. And so there's a huge link at the beginning that still exists today, I think, between space and nuclear deterrence.
Yeah, and when I look at the top level national security policy, one of the big questions that we always get from a policy standpoint is, how is the space domain viewed? How is it treated? And maybe some of that has changed over time. But what I saw researching into the Eisenhower administration is that the space domain really from the beginning was seen as this outlet to observe and provide stability in the nuclear arms race, nuclear deterrence sphere between the US and the Soviet Union. Because if you remember in 1960, the U-2 aircraft was shot down over the Soviet Union, proving that air-based surveillance from especially Soviet homeland nuclear issues, it's not difficult to think about how that could be threatened, that could be disrupted. And so we looked to space. The Eisenhower administration looked to space. But satellites aren't invulnerable either. So I always thought it was interesting how the Eisenhower administration took kind of a diplomatic legal track to trying to say, hey, let's not mess with satellites because we are specifically trying to use them to prevent nuclear surprise. And if you mess with our nuclear warning satellites, then we might think that you're about to give us a nasty surprise and we're going to respond accordingly.
I think that's a good reminder of kind of the origins of where we got to today. And that fear of strategic surprise, was forefront in people's minds in that era of the 1950s. Pearl Harbor, if you think about it, only happened like 15, 16 years before Sputnik. And the fear of a Soviet first strike on the United States at that time, the U.S., the national leadership at the time was very concerned that they didn't understand what was going on inside the Soviet Union, how many missiles they had, how many nuclear weapons they had, where they were positioned. how many they had tested. It was very hard to see into the Soviet Union. And so the satellites offered this ability to see what the Soviet Union was doing, and what helped lower tensions and helped enable eventually, by the late 60s, early 70s, arms control to help reduce the nuclear threat with the ABM treaty and the SALT I treaty. But the idea of using space to help with strategic stability by providing that, I don't want to say comfort level, but that the risk of sudden surprise was lowered, which was able to reduce tensions somewhat. And so the idea that satellites are providing the strategic stability was worth protecting back in those days. Perhaps the term used back then was, space should be treated as a sanctuary because it helps prevent an accidental war. And so I know you've looked at the sanctuary school of thought or doctrine. Did you have anything about that you wanted to add?
Well, it's funny because in my research, I never found any documents at the time that referred to space as a sanctuary. Instead, it was more common that that term would be used after the fact to represent what happened in the 50s, 60s, and early 1970s. It's certainly the notion of trying to at least keep space a strategically stable domain, even though a lot of the treaties and the international negotiations, of course, reinforce the notion of trying to keep space peaceful. It's important to note that space has always had a military aspect. It hasn't been exclusively civilian activities happening in space. And so that was one facet of this era when you're trying to develop the law and policy to keep space stable, to protect satellites, is the notion that peaceful uses came to be a term referencing non-aggressive. So not actively going after other things in space or using space directly in terms of causing harm to others in some way. And that means that peaceful didn't mean non-military. Again, it just meant non-aggressive. And so that's kind of a myth that sometimes gets perpetuated up through time, is that space hadn't been militarized at the time. I would say that there's that difference between militarization and weaponization in the context. And that really would be a good spot to maybe transition to the next era when we dig in a lot deeper to the question of weapons and space. The last thing that I want to leave on this earlier era, though, is that there was development of weapons relevant to space. The first anti-satellite weapons that were tested and even somewhat operational, though they were nuclear-tipped anti-satellite weapons, so not exactly the most flexible that you could imagine. Those were developed late 50s, throughout the 60s. They just weren't very high priority. And again, they weren't super usable. But let's look at now the 80s. Started in the late 70s with the Ford administration kind of hitting the button to look more directly into ASATs. But how did this debate develop as we got into the 80s?
Yeah, well, I agree with everything you just said. I just want to mention one other thing, was the use of space as a high ground in the late 50s and 60s to attack targets on Earth was, that's where this thinking originated, that whoever controls space can control the world, can control Earth. And the big fear, of course, sometimes I think we forget about, is that nuclear weapons would be based in space and could, attack, basically drop from orbit and hit a target basically with no warning around the world. And so that was so strategically destabilizing that it was agreed in the Outer Space Treaty to prohibit stationing nuclear weapons in outer space. Now, conventional weapons, there was no such prohibition. So I think that's just important to carry forward to today, that we kind of take for granted or assume that nuclear weapons aren't stationed in space. And so carrying that forward then to the late 70s, early 80s, the U.S. started integrating the satellite capabilities, communications capabilities, weather capabilities, PNT a little bit before GPS, the predecessor to GPS. And say again?
PNT is what, for those who might not know the alphabet soup that we're throwing at them?
Positioning, navigation, and timing. There was also limited capabilities in the 60s and 70s with a different satellite constellation before the global positioning system was launched and put up, and it had much greater capability. But anyway, these capabilities were beginning to be integrated into the U.S. military at some level. As a former Defense Meteorological Satellite Program operator, DMSP, the weather data was mainly used for strategic purposes in the nuclear deterrence context. But there were some what they called tactical terminals for gathering weather data, like on aircraft carriers and some other like division level headquarters, but they weren't integrated at the individual warfighter level, so to speak. But along with that integration of more space services, became the fear that they could become targets. They'd make good, impactful, make a difference to take them away from the United States. And so more ASAT weapons, anti-satellite weapons, were developed in the 70s. The Soviet Union tested many times kinetic orbital ASAT weapon. The United States started to develop its own kinetic ASAT weapon because we thought, we need to be able to counter the Soviet Union's ASATs and protect our satellites. So that kind of started in the early 80s.
Yeah, and that thread that you had brought up earlier about seeing space as the ultimate high ground, I think that really carried through in the 80s as well, not just for the satellite capabilities themselves, but with the Reagan administration very famously proposing the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, which included, among other things, the notion of space-based missile interceptors. So tinkering with other potential uses of space in conflict. The term space control became used more and more in this era. So thinking about how do you maintain control over your operations or influence other operations in space. And then, as you mentioned, with the development of ASATs, that culminated on the US side with an actual destructive ASAT test in the mid 80s. And so that was the case in which a satellite was destroyed to test a capability. And that kind of, in some ways, was the peak of, in that era, the development of both the theory and the practice of how to deal space as a contested domain.
And I think that's right. And I'd just like to continue pulling these threads forward from the beginning. So we have the nuclear deterrence mission, nuclear warfighting mission as a high priority. We have the high ground concepts all the way from the beginning through the 80s with SDI, the development of space control or space superiority starting to emerge in the 80s. And then going into the 1990s, that things, the thinking continued to evolve, but these other things continue to be carried through right to today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with space, a lot of times today we talk about things that have changed, things that are new. But as we're going through this history, I think it's pretty clear there is a lot more continuity than you might expect, or a lot of solid origins of different concepts that are maybe 50, 60 years old and not entirely new concepts. But yeah, let's look at the 90s. The Soviet Union collapses, the Cold War ends, but right at around the same time, we have the first Gulf War. And this is what has been referred to many times by folks as the first space war, or the first war to really use space for operational purposes, not just that strategic level nuclear stability purpose. And you had mentioned all of these capabilities that had been developed in the years before really getting put to the test on the ground. And a lot of times I've seen referenced that the 90s, especially with the collapse of the Soviet Union being an era where we don't have a clear adversary that might threaten us in space. But I didn't really see that reflected in policy and discussion as, okay, we can take a break now. We don't have to worry, because the Gulf War demonstrated just how valuable those capabilities are. And that, I think, resonated with a lot of folks, that therefore you need to protect them and make sure that you can keep using those capabilities in the future, and recognizing that others who might want to mess with the United States might try to do so through space.
Yeah, so as I mentioned with the DMSP Defense Meteorological Satellite programs, Desert Shield, Desert Storm back in 1990, 91 was a real turning point in the integration of these space capabilities into the joint force. Just a quick war story. So DMSP, as I mentioned, was set up to provide strategic support. So when Desert Storm kicked off, they said somebody in Cheyenne Mountain, I was in an operations center in Omaha, Nebraska at the time because we were mainly supporting Strategic Air Command way back in the day. But they called our operations center and said, we want you to stay on this phone line 24/7 until this war is over, because we need to be able to talk to you immediately because we're using your weather data in the conflict. And the normal channels are not timely enough. And so we had to have a phone sitting on our desk with just an open line with nobody talking on it or using it for anything. Back in the operator, it was I think it was called Autobahn Air Force or DoD phone network. The operator would come on after 10 or 20 minutes, see if anybody was talking on the line, and hang up. So for a couple of days, when we were trying to maintain contact with Cheyenne Mountain, but the operator of the network came and kept hanging up and we asked what was going on and said, oh, well, we listen for a minute. If nobody's talking on the line, we hang up because that line is needed for communications for people who actually are using it. But that's how far away they were from integrating, space to the warfighter, so to speak. So after Desert Shield and Desert Storm, the 90s were really focused on integrating space into the cockpit, into the wheelhouse, as the Navy says, space to the warfighter, blue force tracking, GPS guided bombs, and so on and so forth. So a lot of energy and effort went into this space to the warfighter initiatives, and it's complex. It's very hard. We made huge progress by the end of the 1990s and through Iraqi freedom and on to today, where we kind of take for granted. I think that we take for granted how integrated it is. But you're right, it did end up creating nice targets for adversaries. They could affect our joint force by attacking satellites. So we had to start grappling with that problem too.
And a lot of the literature sometimes refers to specifically the 90s and early 2000s as a return to those sanctuary policies that we had talked about in the Eisenhower administration. But when I looked through a lot of the documents, it wasn't so much of we don't have to worry anymore. It was more of a shift in the approach to protecting satellites, or the approach to treating space as a contested domain. And that one actually traces back to the ASAT test that I mentioned in 1985. That ASAT test produced a lot of debris, and policy leaders in the US recognized that. And so instead of saying entirely that they were giving up on treating space as a contested domain, there was a shift to what are more reversible means, less debris producing means of considering concepts like space control and space superiority. So an interesting kind of subtle nuance in how things shifted at the time. But the other effect that I know that you have lots to say on this one is that there was perhaps a perceived splintering between nuclear and space issues, that as space became more and more relevant on the tactical and operational level, there seems to be kind of a division in some of the theory that says you can think about space just for a space perspective and not from a nuclear deterrence perspective. And what do you have to say to that?
Yeah, I think, if we remember, I can remember the 1990s. But the Soviet Union had collapsed. We were trying to make them our friend, right? We joined them in partnership on the International Space Station. They were reducing hundreds, if not thousands, of nuclear warheads. We had the START treaty, Strategic Arms Reduction Talks treaty, to reduce very significantly the number of ICBMs and pointed at the United States and vice versa, and other nuclear weapons. And so there was a lot of stability and hope that Russia now would become part of the global community, a responsible member of the global community. China was also opening up, and there was a lot of hope that China's opening to the West and economic integration with the rest of the world would temper their a perceived threat from China at the time and bring them into the global community. And China at the time, I can't remember the exact number, but had maybe 20 nuclear warheads or maybe 20 intercontinental ballistic missiles. So it was very small scale number of nuclear missiles. The threat from China, of course, 20 nuclear warheads could do a lot of damage, but relatively speaking, it was not that significant to be worried about. So the concern that an attack on a satellite that's providing missile warning or strategic deterrence in some way, nuclear command and control, the idea that attack on one of those would be the precursor to a nuclear first strike and indicate a nuclear first strike is on its way, that thinking kind of disappeared, right? It became plausible to think about attacking satellites in space and having space conflict on and among satellites, whatever the approach might be, without generating or risking quick or sudden nuclear escalation. And so that carried through. I think that break in the nexus between nuclear deterrence and space warfighting, I think, began in the 1990s, and a lot of that thinking, I think, is still out there today, that we can contemplate space warfighting without worrying too much about nuclear escalation. I'll stop there because we have so much more to talk about, but I could talk all day about my concerns in that area.
Yeah, well, let's move into the modern era and what the products are of some of the discussions that we've looked at so far. I know a lot of folks refer to 2007 as being a really big turning point in at least the public discussion about space threats, how to protect, how to defend, when it comes to that. And it's all because of China's destructive direct descent anti-satellite test that they did, destroying one of their own satellites early in 2007. Now, this produced, I think it's about 3,000 pieces of long-lived debris, and is referred to as the single most polluting event in the human history of space, more debris produced than any other event that we've seen. And so this was pretty startling. I think I've heard a lot of folks refer to it again as a wake-up call, even though there's a lot of those threads of theory, deterrence that had been existing long before. In the, is it now 15, 16 years since 2007? I do think that there has been a big change in the public debate, in the discussion, and in the organization of military forces. We've now seen space be referred to much more publicly as not only a contested domain, but now as a warfighting domain. What do you think some of the implications of those shifts are?
Well, implications, of course, could be very significant. But in my mind, it's a continuation of the continuation of the trends that we've seen going back decades. But having change in the language and how we describe it, it is important because it helps clarify people's thinking about what we're talking about. So we've been talking about, nuclear ASATs since the 1960s, and contested space, as you found in your research, from the late 1970s, and ASATs and non-kinetic and irreversible conflict in space, and these theories of space control and threats for decades now. But now, with the recognition that this is real and it's not just hypothetical anymore, the change in language helps drive that point home, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what has come of it is a multi-pronged approach to thinking about concepts like deterrence and warfighting in space. Of course, my favorite pet rock is norms of behavior. And that has been a really interesting thread interwoven with concepts of deterrence and defense in space. First of all, physics makes a lot of the concepts of maneuver and the technologies really challenging in space. So I think that a big aspect of deterrence and defense policy is looking at how can we develop international agreements, cooperation, perspective, preparation to respond collectively to potential hostile behaviors in space. And so norms have become this thread that really reflects in national policy, Department of Defense statements and actions as one of the pillars of deterrence in space.
Yeah, that's in 2011, the 2011 National Security Space Strategy, I think, is the first time officially norms, supportive norms of responsible behavior for outer space became official DoD policy. And the IC, actually, by the way, because it was a national security space policy or strategy, I should say. And the reasoning behind it was like, to deter, we have to go back all the way to the Outer Space Treaty, right? They have freedom of use of outer space, which means any country can go anywhere with their space vehicles that they want. There's no limits on what they can do or where they can go. So there was no rules of the road, was another term of art, right, on what you can do in space. And so it was beginning to be understood that as space gets more congested and competitive, there's a need to start defining some rules of the road, norms of behavior, so that if someone is acting threatening, or you maybe a country didn't even know they might be perceived as being acting threatening because they're doing something in space that another country is watching, that could be very destabilizing and lead to a misunderstanding or misperception that leads to conflict. So first things first is there needs to be established some norms of responsible behavior in space to help operators in space understand what the boundaries are before they might be causing concern among other countries or other stakeholders up there that might react because of a misperception or misunderstanding in a very negative way, potentially. And so the idea that norms were was like step one in a deterrence, deterring attacks in space, or deterring warfare in space, we should say, became pretty clear. However, there's always resistance to kind of new ideas. And so we shouldn't take for granted that now I think the most people in senior leadership and decision makers and positions, important positions, understand that norms of behavior for outer space are needed, right? But the first 10 years, from 2011 to 2015, 2018, 2020, the discussion was a lot about why are norms of responsible behavior important? Why do we need norms? So that argument, it took almost 10 years to almost make that argument, I think, in the community and convince the right people that was the way to go. That debate is over now. The U.S. government has, and the DoD and IC, they all agree now that, yes, we do need norms. So then the question becomes, well, what should those norms be? Now, some of these things can be worked in parallel, right? And then how do you actually get norms? So why, how, what, that's all important, and so these are all ongoing efforts in trying to figure out what those norms should be and how do we get to them.
Well, you're preaching to the choir, Mick. I've published a couple papers on norms myself, as have you. So the one other pillar that I really want to make sure we get in before we run out of time is the concept of resilience, since it's not just the matter of the diplomatic and the international political cooperation that we see with norms, but resilience has been such a theme in architectures, in having more diverse or hybrid approaches to what you're putting up in space, going smaller, going with more satellites in your constellations. Any thoughts on resilience?
Yeah, well, to tie it back again to the 2011 National Security Space Strategy, as part of the way, as we mentioned, satellites became more and more integrated into joint warfighting, became more and more important to protect, and so or deter attacks on them. And so there was a lot of thinking and studying on how that should be done. How can you protect or deter attacks on satellites? And the other thing besides norms, there was two other key things, was international cooperation. We need international partners, right? Not because we need their capabilities, the United States necessarily, but they would help with resilience, and they would help complicate an adversary's decision-making because instead of just attacking a US satellite, they might be attacking many countries' satellites, right? Other countries and allies and partners and friends of the U.S. Space capabilities. So a second component of this deterring attacks on space after norms was international cooperation. Once again, we take international cooperation for granted that that's a great policy and we should be doing more international cooperation and partnerships in space. But that was, again, a battle that had to be won in the bureaucracy to convince everybody that that was the path forward. And there was resistance 10, 15 years ago to increasing international partnerships in military space activities. Now, to get to your resilience point, the third part of this 2011 National Security Space Strategy, is said right in there that another key aspect of deterring attacks on satellites is to make them more resilient, so they're not big, fat, juicy targets, as has become a term of art lately. And so, because if an adversary is not confident of success, or that they'll have a good impact, or they'll have an effect by attacking a satellite, and it won't make much difference, then why do it, right? So deterrence by denial, deny them the benefit of the attack on a single fat juicy satellite by making the satellites more resilient, or having new resilient architectures, not just one satellite, but architectures as a whole.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave off there. This actually might be a good stopping point, because although we haven't even been able to dive in yet into the Space Force, modern looks at space superiority, and a lot of other key concepts in contested space, I really just think that means that folks are going to have to tune in to the rest of this season of the Space Policy Show to hear more perspectives on contested space. So thanks for this chat, Mick. I had a great time. Hope you did too.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, there is a lot more to talk about, looking like we've done the kind of a timeline looking backwards up to today, but there's a lot of new innovative stuff down the pipeline: on-orbit service and manufacturing, rendezvous and proximity operations, and on. We could go on for 5 minutes just listing all the new potential things, mega constellations, all these things coming about in the next 5 to 10 years, or if not sooner. And so, yeah, I hope we can continue the conversation. It's a very exciting time.
Awesome. Well, with that, I think let's hand it back to Colleen.
As usual, Robin and Mick create a stimulating conversation. They've appeared together on our show for several other episodes, so thank you both again. We invite everyone to watch or listen to other shows in this series on contested space, either on YouTube or by podcast. In the series, we cover Space Force strategy with Lieutenant General DeAnna Burt, the physics of war in space, space's unique cybersecurity aspects, and more. So all the center's research can be found at csps.aerospace.org. We've got over 100 shows archived on our YouTube channel and found on most podcast platforms. A big thank you to our technical team, James Liggins and Max Siegel. Thank you, everyone.